Good morning and welcome to the CERA Biennial Preconference. This is CERA's Preconference workshop, Centering Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Justice, DEIRJ, within the professional development trainings. Today, this pre-conference workshop is presented by Dr. Jerry Palmer, by Dr. Yolanda Suarez Balcazar, and by myself, Dr. Vernita Perkins. Next slide, please. So we'd like you to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. You can, of course, put your preferred name and any pronouns or identifiers in the chat and or in your screen name. We would also encourage you to list your location, your academic or practice affiliation, any land or labor acknowledgements, and any accessibility preferences if you're comfortable doing so. So we'll give everyone a minute to begin doing that. Okay. And next slide, please. Okay. So in today's agenda, we would like to talk a little bit about why and giving you a little backstory on understanding DEIRJ. We're also going to engage in a short activity that it's more of a thinking activity since we're virtual. Then we're going to move into a biological break. So we'll have a space for everyone to take a break after we finish the activity. And then we'll close the presentation with some DEIRJ tools. Next slide, please. And now we'd like you to meet the presenters. Dr. Jerry Palmer.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much. I know some of you I know, and of course I can't see everybody right this minute, but I'm excited that we are starting this morning with 20 participants. I am an assistant professor at Adler University, as well as the co-founder and managing director of Community Wellness Institute, which provides workshops, etc., social research, and we do consulting with nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations as well. So I appreciated the time. I'd also like to acknowledge the Peoria lands, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux lands on which CWI stands. And as my sister always shares, it's great to acknowledge, but she also says we all must participate and engage in action as well. So, well, thank you for that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yolanda Suarez Balcazar. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am a faculty member and professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I have been a member of CERA for many years since I was a graduate student. And today I'm looking forward to share with you a tool that we can use for professional development as we move forward in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And I am Dr. Vernita Perkins with OmniG Research, which is an research and exploration entity. We recently implemented the Cognition and Behavior Lab so that we could give a closer look and examination of how we exist on this earth and how we interact with each other. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am also in Los Angeles on the Tongva lands. And I acknowledge the labor and exploitation of so many peoples to build the country, this country that we live in. Next slide, please, Jerry. So, understanding why. Next slide, please. Why have ongoing DEIRJ work integrated within professional development training? Next slide, please. Here's 3 reasons why. History and Harm, Policy and Practice, and Disrupting the Status Quo and Creating New Cultures. Next slide, please. So we first want to look at history and harm. There's an old saying that goes along the lines of, if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. We understand that most companies on their websites put in about us, and they usually have a history or a timeline. So when we're in school, we studied what we thought was history. We're finding out a deeper truth now. So it is important to know where you came from and what came before, and to acknowledge and appreciate and understand that. But we even want to take it a step further to saying that it's important to know everyone's history and the actual events, find associated narratives, personal narratives, phenomenological narratives, and also to bring that together in a sense-making process. And so a precursor to understanding DEIRJ work is really understanding where we came from and how the world works and how we move forward. The importance of making sense of the past and fully comprehending it and how it correlates. And we understand that from so many pieces of literature, there's books, and now there's an exhaustive amount of information about how our world operates. So understanding how those pieces come together, I always like to say connecting the dots is essential in understanding how we exist today and interact. Also understanding embedded ideologies and how they cause harm. And in Menachem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, it's a really insightful book. It does not cover all social identities, but it takes a few of them and looks at a reflection of how we have all been traumatized. We have all experienced loss and grief, and how we choose to exist and to move forward. And then the final point for history and harm is understanding how terms such as minority or other stereotypical terms, other sort of colonized identifiers can be harmful, can re-traumatize, and can cause further harm, especially in organizational spaces. Next slide, please.
So the next area that we would like to share with you is that we believe that it's pivotal that we understand how policies and practices, which means recognize institutionalized racism, and these policies and practices within and across institutions have intentionally produced outcomes that put racial groups at a disadvantage. So it's not an issue of the past, that there were policies that segregated and discriminated, but the current policies and practice that continue to separate groups by race. I'm going to rely a lot on the work of Wright and Rogers. The book is American Society, How It Really Works. And they argue that race and race inequalities have powerfully shaped the American history and continue to shape contemporary history. Race continues to divide us and divide America, and ruling elites often use race to protect their interest. They argue in the book that the idea of the second-class citizen, it's not idea of the past, that unfortunately it continues to rule America. Basically, the second-class citizen is officially legally defined as some or less formal practical rights are being denied, or the rights are being reduced or not acknowledged. We understand that there are many examples in today's contemporary society where practices and policies continue to perpetuate against people of color. For instance, police practices that target certain groups of color with restricted law enforcement, judicial practices that systematically impose stiffer sentences on particular categories of people. People who are abandoned by the system after environmental disasters. We had an example of Katrina when it hit New Orleans in 2005, and people of color and Black communities were abandoned by the system after such a horrible environmental disaster. There are many practices today that perpetuate, and we need to be acknowledge of those. We need to acknowledge those practices and be ready to challenge them. For instance, employers not hiring or promoting someone on the basis of race, or landlords renting only to people from a certain race, or perhaps making it more difficult for people of color to get loans. Often these kinds of private discrimination are difficult to detect, and we know that in today's society it's illegal to discriminate. However, many of these practices are there, they're not necessarily enforced, and they're difficult to detect. But discrimination is pervasive and continuous.
Mhm.
Housing is another critical example. The concept of redlining is not a concept of the past. It's a practice that continues. And redlining, we know that is the systematic denial of various services to residents of a specific neighborhood or community, explicitly selective services or raising prices or denying prices just because of the community, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. We also have strong evidence in education as well. For instance, the school to prison pipeline, where harsh disciplines and policies are applied to Black children and children of color. The typical school system that punishes Black kids for misbehaving, while if the same misbehavior is seen in white kid, is interpreted as the kid is having a bad day. The same behavior by a Black kid is interpreted as the kid is a bad kid, and the police needs to intervene. And that's the strong evidence that supports school to prison pipeline. It's all about how are we training our children and how are we applying different policies and practices to correct behavior. I have a graduate student that is working on this topic, and she identified a number of studies that expulsions of kindergarten in Black kids is just really staggering. It's really high. I couldn't believe it. That kids at 5 and 6 have been expelled from kindergarten and from school, and they all happen to be Black kids because of misbehaviors. So these are things that are happening in front of our eyes every day. Right now in Chicago, we are fighting environmental racism, a recycling plant that was housed in a white affluent North community in Chicago closed in part because of the health hazard that it was producing in the residents. And they are in the proposal of moving it to the south side in a community of color, thanks to the fact that the community has been protesting and hunger strikes and marching and protesting this move. The move was put on hold. But these are practices that are happening in front of us every single day. So what do? We need to build solidarities. We need to be aware of these policies and practices. We need to challenge them and work together in advocating for change and racial justice. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Yolanda, for that. So the thesis of what we're sharing today is why incorporate DEIRJ work within professional development workshops or professional development trainings. And one of the things that we want to remember is that primarily, and this may not be for every company or institution, but certainly professional development training often is a area where there's funding involved. And so, in not all cases, but in most cases, or I shouldn't say most, but I say in some cases, funding is involved. And so, when we look at DEI training, though, we typically will hire a consultant to come in and do maybe one or two workshops. It's not included under a mandatory professional development training. And so it should be, right? Because it is certainly interrelated. And as Yolanda and Vernita shared, it also is a requirement, almost it's a prerequisite right now, right? For diverse and inclusive companies as well as academic institutions. Research is demonstrating that when you have a strong, diverse and inclusive organization, you will be at the top of your field, or in terms of driving innovation, in terms of even productivity. Research is demonstrating that your environment, your culture should be diverse and inclusive. And so when we look at why, this topic came up, is we know of companies, or we've been involved in them at some particular point in time, where we had to ask for DEIRJ workshops. And again, consultants come in and they do a good job, but it's not ongoing and it's not on a consistent basis either. It's sort of a standalone. And so this workshop is revolving around this type of work, or this work shouldn't be a standalone. And so, of course, when we look at what it should contain, or what are we talking about, or the whys, right? The part that I want to share just a little bit about is disrupting the status quo and creating new culture. So I bet all of us have been in an organization or academic institution where we've walked in and something was going on, some type of operation or workshop, or even staff meeting, and you said to yourself, now I wonder why they're still doing this that way, right? And so I'm referring to the status quo. And typically this goes on until you get an interrupter or a disruptor that comes in and say, well, I've got a new way of looking at this. Can we do that? And you might not get a positive response, right? So, when we talk about disrupting the status quo, it's important because a lot of times not having diverse and inclusive organizations come from just the habitual way of doing things and upholding the status quo, right? And so just a little bit I'm going to look at is number one. So I teach a diversity and individual difference course at Adler, along with community psychology and social psychology. And so in the diversity course, one of the first things that we do is, or I have the students do, is get in touch with their worldviews. They have to articulate it. They have to know where you're coming from first, right? And that's important, because, and that's pretty much in any model you see, it's going to call for you, students, whoever it is, to begin to get in touch with your own worldviews, your own way of looking at things, your own lens, because you're going to always bring that to the table. And so to that end, organizations should be in that same space where they're working to understand the current culture, where they make their decisions from. And typically, if it's an organization, and as we know, Vernita, right, and Yolanda, we know that it's typically top down. It's not that bottoms up approach. And so you have to work to understand why that is, what you can do to change it. And so if it's in an individual space, then of course we know there's the Harvard IAT, the implicit bias survey that you can work on. You can work on your own worldviews. We can get you some information. There's a couple of great articles out that demonstrates that you're looking at theology, you're looking at your philosophy about life in general, how you navigate life, and several other anthropology, just, you know, where you take from and navigate life from. And so a organization should do the exact same thing, is to understand how they make decisions, why they made them, why don't they have a diverse and inclusive company. And that could be, or academic institution, and that could be for a number of reasons. But importantly, that organization, that institution wants to know exactly why they do what they do. Why do you have that same culture when different cultures will possibly increase your productivity, increase your student retention, your student recruitment and retention, and a number of other areas that makes sense, right? And so, you know, you want to also, this isn't an area that everybody has the expertise in, or everybody doesn't have the knowledge in, the leadership. You can go down the line not comfortable with it. Doesn't necessarily have to be not having the knowledge. Everybody isn't comfortable with putting this type of work forward. It's tough conversations, as we know, that we need to have. There's authenticity involved. And so you want to also look at calling in the DEIRJ experts if and when needed. There is no qualms, or there shouldn't be any qualms about doing that. And the field now is saturated. The field, there are a number of organizations. SCRA is using an organization, or organizations, I should say, as we all move through this space to become equitable and ensure the inclusivity of our spaces. And so, you know, then you can also select your approach. Again, as the field is inundated with leaders and people who are working in this space, you also, there are also different approaches in the way that you want to take a look at this. You know, you may have an approach that may have worked, for example, as a consultant, as someone who facilitates Blackness, anti-racist workshops. I've gone into institutions where they had a African American or people of color committee, where they're charged with bringing forward DEI experts and others to come in as they continue to work to build diverse and inclusive environments. They may have, for example, the Circuit Court of Cook County has an African American employee committee, and they have various names, but they're pretty much all charged to bring together this work. And so when you're looking at that approach, and you decide which one is helpful in this space, an equity audit is helpful, determining where you are. And then, of course, I believe it was Vernita shared, we know where we are, then we have a space to understand where we're going, right? And so in your approach, you know, starting out with, we're here, we want to move to this particular space, right? And my sister, who is the director of diversity and inclusion at Tabor Academy in Massachusetts, always sets goals, always puts forward, and we don't often do this. Sometimes we work in spaces where, and that's okay when it's fluid, or when fluidity is going to be the space you need, but often we need outcome measures too. We need to know if we've acquired or we've achieved the outcomes that we've set for the organization or the academic institution. And so you want to look at, and of course, measurable outcomes. Measurable meaning not just anecdotal, but giving it percentages. 50% of the people in the organization are going to become, or build new relationships with people of different ethnicities. And you could go down that list, right? Different religion, different age, and so forth. And so to that end, you want to know how many employees or how many faculty or whatever the organization is. You want them to know, or you want to know who's accomplished that and how many, because how would you determine, right? And so you get to set your own criteria, your own success criteria in terms of what that might look like. And each organization, again, if you go back up to, and Yolanda is going to do a great job coming up of showing how to use tools that can be instrumental in you goal setting and your learning outcomes and how to measure those outcomes so that you have an awareness of where you are, which is critically important. And I don't want to leave off without accountability. When we are looking at this type of work, we get sometimes caught up in it because, again, those tough conversations we aren't accustomed to having, new language, new ways of thinking, developing critical consciousness, we can get away from accountability. But we always want to hold each other, not just leadership, not just the president of the university, but each and every single person involved in creating this new culture, involved in being accountable. Why? Because as human beings, when it gets hard, we all might sit down. We all might, move away from engaging in spaces that we are uncomfortable with. But if we have someone to say, did you get that done? Did you invite over somebody that's a different ethnicity than you? Did you, walk into a space you might feel uncomfortable in and notice you were the only person there of color or Black African American, name it. And did you do that? Because, it's just not that easy to do. Again, as we all look to human nature that is more comfortable in spaces that we are more comfortable in, right? We've all been socialized, and we won't go off into this particular workshop, but we will be probably holding some in the near future where we will look at these concepts, right? And unpack them so that we all get more comfortable in this new world that we're all creating. So goal setting, outcome measures, and accountability matters, right? Research shows that just even the presence of physical diversity results in that meaning traits, right? Color of skin, ethnicity, etc. That's not even to examine the other aspects of diversity that we don't know unless we articulate it, like religion, what you believe in theologically, etc. And so research shows that just the presence of physical diversity results in better performance. This is companies they're talking about, but let's translate that performance again. If we're talking about an academic institution, to student recruitment, student retention, and let's all go to that point that Dom and Alana talked about, is knowledge, right? This gatekeeping that we're going to begin that we should be beginning to look at to do away with, etc. Because importantly, when we look at performance, again, we can translate that to academic institutions, right? And so when we have increased student retention, increased knowledge being gained, et cetera, whatever that looks like, this can be extremely motivating for others looking into our windows from the outside, whether it's a company or whether it's an academic institution. Also, let's be reminded that companies, and when I say companies, I mean nonprofit organizations, I'm running the list, right? Corporations, nonprofit organizations, faith-based congregations. CWI, my entity, facilitates workshops in multicultural faith-based institutions because let's face it, you bring you into that space as well, and your philosophies and your ideologies, right? And so when you look at that, companies, institutions, faith-based organizations, etc., that lack diversity are going to be called out publicly, and they are, and maybe even lose your congregation, lose your students, lose your faculty, or lose your leadership and staff, right? And so that makes sense. And so uh, moving to this last piece, DEIRJ work, right? And when we say DEIRJ work, of course, I think that I just want to reiterate, we're referring to diversity, equity, inclusion, and we intentionally added RJ or racial justice because diversity doesn't equal equality, equity, or racial justice. But we tend to, it's tended to lean towards being a buzzword. So it's transformative. It's not, and I had Yolanda and Vernita laughing when I said it's not Target. It's not one run and done. This must be an ongoing process, and we believe that it will be. It will result in success and result in a more inclusive space for whether we're talking corporation, faith-based organization, institution, academic institution, and that list goes on. So, let's consider and think through that as we move to Yolanda showing us a great tool that will help us back up to that goal setting, outcome measurement, and accountability space.
So Jerry, before we leave this slide,
Sure.
let's,
Yes.
I just wanted to say that Leora had a question, and I know she has to leave early, so she had a
Oh,
question
great.
in the
Okay.
chat for
Yes.
you. She says, I'm curious about how Jerry elicits / supports a student discussion about worldviews. Could she share those resources? So if you don't mind, if we can just step out of our presentation for a minute and just
Sure.
help her with that question.
Yeah. Can you read it again for
Yes,
me?
I'll read it again.
Yep.
So Leora says, I'm curious about how Jerry elicits / supports a student discussion about worldviews. Could she share those resources?
Sure, yes, that makes sense to me. And so backing up, number one, coming into the door, we all set ground rules. And I specifically said we intentionally. I have my own, such as you can attack another person. And I hope that I'm answering the question that you're asking is to give some ideal of how do I support those tough conversations. And number one, I ask everyone not to attack, right? It's different to having a discussion and you're not saying you did this. You're not calling out people as to their ethnicity or their beliefs, whether whatever they are. We all agree that we are here to respect and honor one another's spaces where they come from. And all we're doing here, and let me back up a little bit from that. My syllabus specifically states that I'm only here to give you a different lens to look through. I'm not trying to break your lens down or disregard your socialization process, but I just want you to have another lens to look through so that you make the decision about what you want to do about it. And so then from that, I asked them all to, if not all, but them to come up with what do you want to put into our ground rules. And so the umbrella are ground rules. What do you want to put in there? And they may come back and say that what goes on in Dr. Palmer's class stays in Dr. Palmer's class, right? That old confidentiality. And so what we're doing is moving past creating what they called a safe space to now what we look at is got to be a brave space, right? So safe and now brave. And then they're creating that for themselves. And then what happens is you get investment in it. That top down doesn't work even in the classroom anymore. You get investment from students when they can determine what it is they want to go on in that environment. And that's part of active learning techniques as well, where they're buying into and having that participatory. And we're talking about inclusive space, right? That has to happen in the classroom as well. So, starting from there. So I hope I'm giving some decent answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, Leora, yeah, I hope that's helpful.
It does help. I mean, I think it's you're framing a really useful way to start off the conversation about brave spaces, which is what I do also.
Yes.
I was asking more about, I guess what I struggle with is, and this is, Daryl Sue, what are some of the implicit, like we may assume that we share certain fundamental assumptions and beliefs about the world. And so I'm wondering about whether there's a way of sort of identifying or taking students through forced choice or something, an examination of their values and their assumptions about the world in so many ways, the nature of knowledge, responsibility for success, what makes for a good life. I'm thinking about all these dimensions that really differ culturally and could, like, so it's that I'm interested in, a framework for having a discussion about different worldviews so that we realize that we don't all see the world the same way. And
so I I think that starts with them understanding their own worldview, Leora.
yeah,
and from that, even though I don't share them with the class, they get to see they're different. They get in touch with their own, because that's the number one starting point that I think may be missed in a lot of cases when we are engaging in these type of conversations. Because once they understand, and so you know what I think you're asking me, I hand out 2 documents. One of them is by I think his last name, and you know what, contact me or send me an email, and I will make sure.
What I'm asking for. What are the tools that you can provide?
Yes, I provide them with a video called What is Your Worldview? And the Think article that gives about 6 dynamics or 6 components of your worldview, from theology, right, to down the line.
Yeah.
Everybody gets that. I think that's the question, or that's the resource.
That is my question.
Yeah. And if you will email me, I'll make sure that you get them. So that, yes, they start out with, and the little video clip might be 6 minutes long, but it's phenomenal in helping them to understand what a worldview is, and everybody's is different. So they don't come to the real conversation thinking that everybody is going to have the same thoughts about every single thing under the sun.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. No, we appreciate your question, and that we're able to, provide some. That's why we're here.
Be included in the link or something so other people could have access to it too.
I will do just that. Yep, I'll make sure I get them in there. And I know that you have to leave, but again,
I have to leave, but then I can come back.
Oh, perfect. Okay, we'll make sure we've got some. We have some resources coming up in the slides, but we'll throw some in the chats as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Yep, thank you. We appreciate you sharing and coming into the room with us. And so to her, Leora's point, there's many resources. We provide some here, and we'll be happy to provide more as we go along. Okay. So now I think Vernita is going to
so we're gonna
right? Yeah.
Get the why. So we've given you 3 reasons why we believe that DEIRJ training is so crucial and vital in professional development training. So we're going to ask you now, what's your why? And to consider what are the other reasons why you would think that DEIRJ is important in ongoing professional development training. So we're going to ask that you just take a moment to ponder it, and then put your why in the chat if you would like, or you can, just take a moment to kind of think about it yourself, why it's important. We've given you the history and the harm, the policy and practice, and also how to disrupt the status quo by creating new cultures. So what is your why, or what's the why that came up for you?
So, Vernita, as they're thinking through that, you do a great piece in OmniG on our story. Can you give some examples of harm? Because we mentioned harm in history, but if you could just kind of think about what the harm or what a harm or harms, we won't, spend the whole day talking about harms, but to think about and share when you are helping people to connect history, what is
Right.
the reason why you should, right, go ahead.
Right. So in our story education, we meet every Wednesday, every week, and we've been doing it now we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary. And part of what the purpose of what we call our story, which is not history, their story, her story, but actually our story, the story of all of us. And archaeologists and anthropologists are continuing to piece together the history of our civilization from the dawn of time till now. And as each of these pieces and artifacts and personal narratives begin to surface, we get to see another frame of why it matters that we understand the why. And as Jerry knows, and many of you who know me know that why is my favorite question. Throughout my life, whenever I asked why as a child, I was always given, kind of the side eye or asked to hush. And so in exploring that in the research that we do in OmniG, it's become clear that the why is that tough question. And we addressed it here today because we want to give everybody a chance to really think about these this social conditioning, these embedded ideologies that have created the spaces that we're in today. And so one of the whys that when we look back at history, we see the harm that's been done. And as Jerry said, based on people's worldviews, everyone can we can do the victim competition and look at who's been more victimized. But in reality, as human beings, we have done a lot of hurting each other, and we have experienced a lot of loss. And in some conversations over the last few weeks, as we prepare for this conference season, one of the things that's come up is that we experience loss. Sometimes it can just be the loss of a favorite pen or your keys, or the loss of life, or the genocide of an entire civilization or culture. And so it's not to say that all those losses are equal, but to understand that loss hurts and it creates that sense of harm. There, we also look at in Wilkerson's book, Caste, where she talks about the hierarchy that we experience in our society. And so, as Jerry was mentioning, when you start blending all of these, and Yolanda mentioned it too, when you start putting all of these things together, it can be quite overwhelming. So one of the huge things that we encourage people to do is to look at history, not from a sense of, that boring high school history class, but actually looking at it and understanding that when you'll see patterns, you see how some cultures tried to solve the problems that we're facing today and how they experience that. And you'll recognize that I think one of the big transformational moments for myself in this our story journey was realizing that something that seemed like a small event in our civilization's past was really detrimental and traumatizing. And I began to see how when you put the pieces together, it really helps you understand that there's a lot of harm going on. And in our, we got a chance as a civilization to pause last year from this pandemic, there were so many horrible things that happened and so many amazing things that happened. And I think one of the greatest takeaways is we had a pause to actually really take a moment to breathe and evaluate where we are, right? So again, I see that people have been putting some of their whys in the chat, and I'm going to ask you to keep those whys going as we move through this next process. And then we will move into a breakout where we can have a little deeper discussion. So once again, ask yourself, what's your why? And then go ahead and put it in the chat and you know, keep it kind of swirling there in the back of your mind. Next slide, Jerry, please. So now we're going to move into our activity. And this will be something that, again, we're working on getting you to kind of really think and do more of an experiential process today. Next slide, Jerry. So now I'm going to tell you a little story. And this little story is just to give a little insight on one slice, one little story, one little slice of an event. I'm going to ask you in this process to just be open-minded. Maybe just take a nice deep breath before we move into it and just allow yourself, even if you want to close your eyes, and just allow yourself to just imagine this little short story that I'm going to tell you. And then we will, from there, move into breakouts. So I want to tell you a story about the new hire. So there is a competitive company, and this organization, you can think of it as a university, it can be an organization, it can be a nonprofit. They are known for being very competitive, top of their field, and they tend to primarily hire young white males. They found that that's a more successful approach. They do have people of color and women and non-binary people in their organizations. They have people who have accessibility, I want to say accessibility experiences, but they tend to focus on hiring young white males. Recently, they lost 3 very crucial people of color in their organization. Now, we don't know if that was from layoffs. We don't know if it was from resignations or if it was from firing, but they lost 3 vital people of color from their organization. And in this climate that we are in, worried about the legalities and how that looks, they immediately hired a Black female to run their human resources department, division, and they added images of people of color to their website. So prior to that, their website just included products and services and also showed a lot of white males, and they redid their website and showed people of color. And they included those people of color in all of their marketing materials. So they did a revamp of their marketing materials. So I want to just take a minute. Once again, I'll just reiterate that this is a competitive organization. They're well known in their industry. They primarily hire young white males. They recently lost 3 people of color. And we don't know whether it was layoffs. We don't know if it was resignations or firing. And in the current climate, they chose to hire a Black woman who will run who's running their human resources division. So that's the person who would be hiring, the front-facing person who would be doing all the hiring and doing all the employee engagement and professional development. And they added images to their website and their marketing materials with people of color. Next slide, Jerry. So now we're going to move into breakouts. It looks like we have 23 people on here, so we're going to move into breakouts. we will break into groups. We'll have a thorough discussion, and then we're going to return to this main group, to the main room here, to have a summary. And so we're going to ask that if anyone is within the breakouts would be interested in doing a summary of what your breakout discussed afterwards, we'd ask you to consider that. And so the question that we're going to take into the breakout is, what are the reasons why you think DEIRJ should be integrated into professional development training, and your thoughts on the 3 reasons why that we mentioned today? And then we'll also just have a discussion about the little story I told you. And so, Amber, if we could get some assistance in breaking out, and I think we're going to do.
I did 4.
Yeah, so I think, so we have 23, so we do 2 groups of 8 and 1 group of 7, right?
So I did 4 rooms so that you
Okay,
don't
4
have
rooms.
so many in 1,
Okay,
2, 3,
good.
4, 5 people in there, or you will
Okay.
have a couple more in one. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So then, okay, so whenever you're ready then, Jerry.
Okay, yep, working
Thank
on
you.
it.
And then people take a note of the room you're in. Yeah.
Something is happening here.
Oh, I did it for you, Jerry.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
And Vernita, we're going to be in the cruise for about 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone.
So now we would like to ask each of the groups. We're gonna do our biological break in a minute, but we'd like to ask each of the groups if someone can just we'll just do this organically. Whoever feels compelled from each of the groups, I'll just number them off, and then that person can just speak on a summary of kind of what was discussed. So can we start with room 1?
Hi, everybody. This is Kyra Brown, room 1. We had, we actually talked about a couple of different things, but, and just the reality that, based on the story that you told, we were like, okay, yeah, that's not going to work. But the main things that arose was, in terms of reason, was the need for kind of this culture shift. Because you can't just kind of put these band-aids on things. And so we need to be able to integrate this so that we can have a culture shift, and so that folks can feel valued and supported in that space. And also it can help with facilitating kind of conversation around that's targeted towards what people respond to. So we talked about kind of the importance of DEIRJ work and the financial return on investment, but also these other things that ensure organizational vitality in whatever facet that means. And then we talked about just like our own kind of context and what's going on in our own spaces. And that was really nice. So shout out to room 1. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, room 1. And now we'll go to room 2. So who would like to talk? Who would like to speak on room 2?
Well, I'll take a stab at it and invite other members if there are other pieces of our discussion that are not that I do not recall. I invite anyone from our group. We had a very lively discussion, and we started out really talking about systems within organizations and what are some of the barriers to getting to DEIRJ. I think a lot of our discussion first really talked about that this system as in terms of some of the ways that people of color are tokenized and marginalized, even with positions of power, and how those decisions by those in power to give, say, the HR director or the VP of HR to be, say, a woman of color or someone who checks off some of those DEI boxes, but then that person has a lot to contend with in terms of being in that role. They are, in fact, and we talked about being harmed even being in that role, because they're oftentimes expected to uphold the status quo. They're oftentimes expected to not have the power to make change. They're not disruptors. They're not designed to be disruptors in that role. So the very thing that's meant to supposedly move the organization forward is in fact creating harm within the organization and moving them further backward from goals that are DEIRJ related. So we talked about that and on all of the pieces where that harm is felt by that person, and how oftentimes any efforts to deal with DEIRJ are individualized to a person's concerns and not projected to be a concern for the entire organization. So if you have a problem, go to EAP and see if they can help you out. We have EAP benefits if you're having problems with harm. But there's no systemic response to that same harm.
Interesting.
So we talked about that. We talked about hierarchies and power and how hierarchies are very oftentimes things that we defer to when we talk about organizations. We wrestled with the idea of dismantling hierarchies and how and what tools and possibilities there are in dismantling hierarchies within organizations to support achieving DEIRJ better. And one of the things that we talked about was how just naming who we are in that space and what our roles are, even if we have positions of power, can help in managing that process in a way that that supports moving closer to DEIRJ. So if I know I have power in my position in relationship to others, naming what that power is and how I intend to use it in supporting the process and goals that we have together, and not seeing it as something that we can't talk about or we can't name or we can't acknowledge, because that acknowledgement acknowledges accountability within that role, and not acknowledge, and that's important and healthy. So we talked about that. We talked about other barriers that impede DEIRJ. We talked about some of the issues with fear, and how that in itself is a huge problem, and it goes back into our collective history in terms of slavery. It goes into our collective history and how we relegated positions of Africans in particular within our society, that based on fear that rebellions, fear of positioning themselves beyond where they're relegated, in some ways threatens others' positions. I'm saying that very, very politely, but y'all know what I'm talking about. So we talked about how all of those historical harms particularly to Black folks, and we talked about it, harms in terms of Indigenous folks as well, but particularly in terms of Black folks, the harms that have persisted to relegate Black folks to out of fear, have had lasting impacts on how we view Black folks within space even now, and how we have to address that within organizations, because some of those same vestiges of relegating positionality of Black folks to be of service, to be and to not have too much power, and threatening structures that we all acknowledge exist, are things that we still have to grapple with, period, dot. And not grappling with that is going to be a hindrance to any efforts that we make internally. Personally, looking at that for ourselves, where we find those threats personally within ourselves, and looking at that within organizational structure. So did I miss anything, y'all?
Well, I'd just like to throw in one of the solutions that we discussed was the Aboriginal or Indigenous approach to life and living.
Yes.
That really puts a premium on the transpersonal belief and the essential nature of our reciprocal responsibility. I am because we are.
Yes.
And taking that responsibility to heart allows us to build structures that support both diversity and inclusion in how we interact with each other.
Yes, yes. Thank you, George. That was what we discussed in terms of a way to really just challenge and disrupt some of the barriers that we all acknowledged exist. Thank you, George. I think that puts a bow on it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that those hierarchies. So yeah, so we talked also about organizational communities as opposed to organizations, so that it was more community based and more flattened hierarchy and more more engagement and more transparency. Thank you, room 2. Beautifully done. And now can we have room 3?
This is Emma from room 3. So we had 5 people in our group: Sonia, Melissa, Jerry, and Gloria. And we talked about kind of similar to what group 1 talked about in terms of creating a culture that Kyra discussed. And in relation to this cultural piece, we thought how we would make that happen to make this culture is to identify DEIRJ as a priority, within the organization, thinking about the expectations that we have of each other and in our roles, whether it be teaching or whether it be practice work, and that competence in this realm is a lifelong activity. And so like the one and done is not going to make it happen. It's just going to be like, oh, we checked a box and we're done. But we need constant reflection over time. We need everyone to take responsibility for this. So it's not just one person, that it's their responsibility to be the chair of this committee, if that's what's happening, and their responsibility to host activities and their responsibility to educate, but that we potentially all take turns in identifying what it is that we can bring to the conversation to move it forward from our own perspective. And someone said just to even, meet the needs of our people. So if you're a practitioner, and I mean, I think about this as a teacher as well, that whoever's in my classroom, I need to be able to meet their needs as an individual. So whether I have Polish students or Muslim students or Black students or Native American students, or women, I think, or people who identify as non-binary, or people who have a non-heterosexual sexual orientation, like how am I meeting your needs as a practitioner or a teacher? And then we finally thought about the importance of intersectionality in all of this conversation, because that speaks to how complex it can become, and it is, to develop solutions. And when we think about intersectionality, we can consider how many more of us are actually impacted, and we can think about the depth of how much this harm penetrates certain people, and also think about how do we really break down people's experience. So, it's not just being, just part of one category. And so then we finally, Jerry finally thought about, well, it's this whole idea of when we have these types of activities that bring us together to talk about all these different identities that we hold, that we share commonalities with each other, and we develop a consistent relationship just to share with each other, just to understand each other. So it's really, ultimately, a goal of this would be to have increased understanding and increased knowing of each other and all of our complexities that we all bring to the table. So that was our group. Did I miss anything out? Wonderful people.
No, I think you covered it beautifully. Thank you.
And then I think we have one room left, room 4. Yes.
Yes, and I'll try to reflect on some of the things that weren't already mentioned by the other groups. So we talked about the reasons for integration of DEIRJ, but we also talked about the case. And so the conversations, of course, intertwine. And one thing for the need, one reason for the need to continue to have the integration into professional development, is that it was mentioned that there continues to be this intended miseducation that is occurring within society for purposes of maintaining the status quo. And so if there's going to be miseducation, then there needs to be this intentional education and integration, getting to a point where these concepts are just integrated in what we do. And so they become, quote unquote, more so common sense and not something that is a checkbox or, a to-do item. So we talked about that. We talked about the importance of demonstrating how things show up in the world. So how, issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, how those things show up in the world. And that's part of the training, is helping people to understand and continually see how that shows up, and recognizing that sometimes people are not coming from a place of harm when they do or enact things that maintain the status quo and or their positions of power per se. We reflected on, in the perfect world, we wouldn't even need to be asking the question of why we should have DEIRJ integrated, and that it would be nice to be at a point where the climate in society has truly changed and there's not even a need for the discussion. So we have to continue to champion the discussion until we get to the point of intentionality and true integration. And there was also talk, again, how this relates to capitalism and growth and profit, and that whole spectrum of, changing knowledge and then going to integration and then application, and then eventually this human dimension where it's just innate in all of us to consider these things. I think those are some of the key points that weren't covered, but again, my team members in the breakout can offer anything that I may have missed.
Okay, so thank you so much, all the rooms. We really appreciate the feedback and the summaries and the information. And I'm so glad we had so many lively discussions. And now, next slide, Jerry, please. So now we're gonna do what we're fondly calling a biological break. So this is a chance to get up and stretch and grab a bite to eat, perhaps, or kind of take care of your personal needs. And we're going to ask everyone to be back in 10 minutes. So that will be in my time, 10 o'clock Eastern time, 1 p.m. So if you will please be back then, and then we'll continue with our workshop programming.
And CST, yes, Central, let's come back at noon.
Yes.
Yep,
right.
Great, thank you.
Analyze, apply, and integrate. The next level is the integration. How do we move from foundational knowledge and being able to analyze it, assess, and then integrate it into all other things that we do in our life, academically or in practice? How do we promote the ability to make connections between theories, connections between models, and connections to what's happening in the world today? In the integration part is when we compare, contrast, identify, analyze, and then how do we move that to the human dimension? Basically, focus on understanding and learning about oneself, and understanding and learning and interacting with others. Then it moves into the caring dimension. And the caring dimension, it focuses on developing and adopting new ways and new values for exploring feelings and concepts and ways of learning. How do I become a better learner? But looking at resources and knowing what those resources might be. So let me give you a couple of examples that apply to me. And now we're going to see how can we use this tool to help us move towards professional development for ourselves or for our students or our practitioners or our colleagues. For instance, in foundational knowledge, I felt that I had really good background information about facts about racial history in the United States, having grown up in Latin America. But I did not know good enough and well enough and be able to describe critical race theory. So that was a goal for me. My learning goal in the last 6 months was I'm going to learn to understand and articulate the tenets of critical race theory. How do we apply it to the students? What is the knowledge that we students, practitioners, we want them to have? Application. In application, we often teaching ourselves, our students or practitioners, how to compare models between cultural relevance and cultural humility, or models that explain implicit bias. In my case, I really was interested in applying teaching strategies that promote DEIRJ in the classroom. I had a hard time a year ago, and I was trying to focus on learning, discussing, observing, dialogue with others, and analyzing the readings to see if I could apply that into my teaching strategies in the classroom. Integration. To me, one of my intended goals was to compare and integrate critical race theory with other models and other models that related to cultural relevance, to cultural competence, to racial justice, and how to compare the and intersectionality. And how did I move into that goal? Comparing, integrating, analyzing, dialogue with others, and trying to do it on a consistent and intentional way, like we just were talking about. The human dimension. The human dimension, I think, is pushing us to explore our feelings, to explore our background, who we are, where we came from. I often do exercises with my students to help us reflect about that background, biases that we all might have, and engage in that dialogue about how do we change that. We need to acknowledge our own biases, our own shortcomings as humans, but that, what do we do, right? Through dialogue and ongoing learning, how do I change that? In my case, my example, I wanted to explore more the impact of systemic racism on health disparities. So I got really interested into that, and it's part of my research as well. And I had conversations with people of color, Latinos, Latinx community, and Black community on how racism was impacting their health, kind of to open those eyes into what is that human dimension. Often when we're talking about providing opportunities for students, we send them out to surface learning opportunities or community practicums. But how are we integrating that with dialogue, with analysis, with reflection, and goal setting, like Jerry was talking about earlier on? What can I do better? How can I become better? The caring category is really exploring those feelings and interests. I'm able to demonstrate empathy, compassion, understanding. And that's something that I'm working on in my work with Latinx immigrant families with children with disabilities. And learning how to learn. Identifying those resources. I am trying to identify those resources that help me better my learning. So right now I am finalizing the book about American society, how it really works, and another book about cats, and trying to integrate my learning, but also making it transformational and reflective. So we thought that this tool might be helpful. And how do we apply it to promote our development as professionals, but also the development of people you're working with, whether it's students or practitioners. So we wanted to take about 10 minutes and reflect about how could you use this tool, whether it's to set goals for yourself or to help the people you work with as a practitioner, as a educator, and setting goals. And then we're gonna break into groups and discuss it, okay? So take about 10 minutes and we're gonna ask Amber to help us set up the groups. So we're gonna, there's 17 of us, we're gonna do 4 or 3 groups maybe. Well, for,
Oh, I just did 4.
okay,
Like
that's
last
fine.
And then Jerry, can you advance the slide just so that we can share the question that
Yep.
next? So this is a question for this second breakout. How will you use the tools that Dr. Yolanda was just sharing, or other models to integrate DEIRJ training?
Right. Maybe Vernita, can we go back and people can take a photo of
Yep.
the tool that they
Oh,
might use
perfect.
in their breakout groups?
Yep.
You want to take a photo? And then join your breakout group and we will convene in, did we say 10 minutes and discuss it collectively?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. For 10
Okay.
minutes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Vernita, can you add me back to breakout room 3?
Yep,
I think-
you should have a,
yeah.
is your join come up?
No, it
Okay.
did. It did.
Oh,
and then
okay,
I
yeah,
hit it.
there you go. Okay. See you in 3.
Thank you. 3.
Let's see if it's, let me check and see if it's showing up for you. Gloria, you said for 3. Oh, never mind.
If you would like to share your thoughts about the tool and how you might apply it.
I think we're group number 1. I don't remember. I just know I went into a group. Am I stepping on group 1's toes?
It's okay, go ahead.
Well, we just talked about applying this model to faculty training, how it would be great to include in faculty training. I also spoke about we have adjunct training as well. So it would definitely be a great fit for our college. And also this can be integrated into the classroom as well. So in various different ways in various classes. And really, I was thinking about most of my students are online in community psych. So really providing space and intentionally creating questions that will really allow them to critically think and have that online dialogue between them, because we know that online model is so unique, but how do you do that intentionally so it's very enriching?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Group number 2. If anyone from,
I can try. It's Megan. Hi, y'all. We spent a lot of time talking about the caring piece and the importance of that and how much resistance there is to that, whether it's in, you know, corporations or academia, and just like culturally, can be difficult to get people to talk about feelings. At the same time, you know, when we're talking about racial justice and other forms of oppression, there's all these harms, and we talked about that and the need for people to be able to understand that. And we discussed, you know, I think Dr. Perkins talked about an example of like people actually having to witness it by watching the video was one strategy they'd seen, and that was a helpful way of actually getting people to like hear and feel it, not just dismiss it. And then we also talked about how I guess how caring and harm are portrayed, and how we tend to talk about microaggressions a lot. That can be problematic because it can be dismissive of how big some of the things that we tend to call microaggressions are. So I think those were a lot of the main themes. But we focused a lot on that caring piece and how unusual that is. Fill in if I missed anything. Thank you.
Very good points.
Excellent, Megan.
Very good. Group number 3. Do we have a rep from group number 3?
We talked about intersectionality being our learning outcome, our intended learning outcome. And so when we talked about this foundational knowledge about critical thinking skills, we all reflected on our own positions, you know, with the teacher or practitioner, and various ways. I mean, as a teacher, I would think about providing case studies for students to reflect on maybe an abnormal psychology, specific mental diagnosis. But then I would ask them in the case study, on the vignette, I would propose that maybe this person who has this diagnosis is also a woman, is also bisexual, is also from Mongolia, wherever. The idea that we could first think about how this person experiences the diagnosis, but then how does that diagnosis get shaped when they have all these various different identity perspectives. And so, and then also if we're thinking about being a practitioner, we could, you know, we're maybe collecting information through individual client surveys, and that when we get to the open-ended piece at the end of a survey, how do we explore that piece further? You know, so it's not just the identification that you have this disorder or, you know, this particular issue, but then how do we consider that individual experience? So it's not necessarily about data that's been collected, you know, with all these samples within academia, but what is the individual experience of that person, and how do we attend to that, whether it falls in line with what academics think, or whether, you know, it's something just unique to them, which is okay. And, you know, seeing the whole person, oftentimes we minimize, I mean, just like with the microaggression, you know, it's a strange word. It's so offensive when you just say it out loud. It's like, hang on a minute, a microaggression, okay. But what is that for that person? So this caring piece, seeing the whole person, and, you know, learning that learning is never complete. You know, it's just constant. I think the idea that people consider, oh, I've been to school, I've got a PhD, I've got a master's degree, I've got a Bachelor of Science, that we're done. We're never done. You know, the PhD just means that you get an opportunity to inspire other people to recognize that they're not done. So just this constant reflection of who we are, how we're engaging, what is our own personal space and our own personal experience, and how does that impact someone else's discussion or interaction with others.
Excellent points. Thank you. Megan, group number 4.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we had a wide-ranging discussion, and we were sharing, you know, looking at where we see gaps in this kind of framework not being holistically used in some of our experiences of faculty trainings, and where we could see some potential to use it to maybe get through some of the resistance that might be out there to looking more deeply at oppression and racism. I was also sharing, I shared that I have been using the FINK model with my professional development training, and, you know, outside of higher education for a couple of years now. And in fact, my practice name is based upon the idea of the heart dimension, the head dimension, and the hands dimension, and that all of those are important. And that led us into reflecting a little bit more, like it sounds like other groups did, about the heart part, which, you know, I think of that as the caring and the human dimension parts of the six, the model. So, you know, we talked a little bit about how that is especially critical with in the ways that white supremacy numbs us and causes us to distance, you know, especially for white folks, to distance from our emotions, and how that can ultimately impact the, you know, the quality of what we do in the world, and how to get past some of the barriers to that kind of learning. We were starting to talk about, you know, some of these things that others started to address about how do we do that in a way that is not putting the labor either on the persons of color in the classroom, or, you know, displaying the community in a way that is perpetuating harm and trauma, making sure that we have practices and strategies that are not doing those things. And, you know, that was kind of where we ended. We were beginning that conversation. But I would invite the others to add to that.
Any other comments that everybody wants to add? Anyone? I mean, overall, these are great comments, and synthesizing, this is really everyone's responsibility, professional development, as we move forward to address DEIRJ. It's everyone's responsibility. It needs to be a journey. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be transformative, and invite for dialogue, analysis, application, and challenge one another, and challenge systems and practices and policies that perpetuate racism. Any other comment before I turn it over to Jerry? Thank you.
Yeah, this has actually been great, and we are definitely hoping that, you know, something we've said or shared here today will prompt your thinking and continuing to develop critical consciousness around this particular topic. And as we move forward to create those inclusive and equitable and inclusive environments that we are looking for. And so, you know, in good timing, we have just kind of look at a summation, look at a summary of what we talked about today. So we started out and talked about 3 reasons why DEIRJ work should be incorporated into professional development training. And we want to remember that definitely that this is not Target. It's not a run and done, but that it should be continuous work, because life is continuous, right? Interactions with people are continuous and ongoing. They are not just, life doesn't get lived out in 1 session or 2 sessions. We have to wake up every day interacting with people, you know, bringing inclusivity into the space. I liked that we recognize the accountability, the challenging portion of it, and that it's everyone's responsibility. We also want to reflect on the fact that and we are people who care, we want to reflect that when we aren't living in and navigating life from an inclusive, equitable, inclusive space, we can harm people, and we might be doing it inadvertently, but it still happens, right? The intent could be one thing, but when it lands on somebody else, for example, we talked about mentioned the word, at least, microaggressions, and, you know, typically implicit biases, etc. So, you know, to become more conscious, and my word that or term is Freire's critical consciousness. This is Fanon and Freire's critical consciousness approach, that we are always in that space. We provided a tool that can be used in helping to frame out this work. And it's easier in chunks, and it's more helpful. As Yolanda shared, she's spent some time understanding critical race theory. There's a lot of controversy out there about it. We have administration, we have legislators out, you know, saying this is not a good idea, that we should teach diversity and critical race theory on our campuses, and you might agree if you don't really know what it is, or you may not know where to go. Even more importantly, if you don't understand the concept of it. So it takes a moment to do that, and you can use the tool to frame out to what's your objective of it. Again, I go back to my sister's point about objectives. We need to have some concrete objectives in what we're trying to do, and to be able to know at the end of the workshop, at the end of the year, whatever that might look like, how to measure that. What does that look like from an individual and a collective space? And so we went into our workshops again to understand that, right? To apply it. Basically, we all know that applying is the end, or that we want to end classes, et cetera, with application, because we are going out into the world, we're sending students in the world. And so we want to move theory to practice in helpful, beneficial ways that we all can be a better society, a more equitable, inclusive society as we continue this work. And so we make very good time today, all of us. I'm going to turn it over to Yolanda and Vernita. We have a few minutes if they'd like to share any concluding thoughts to leave the attendees with, to leave you with. And we will certainly hope that next week, this is the pre-conference week, that although it's been great, right? All the pre-conferences, you have a couple of other ones I know coming up tomorrow, I believe, and Friday, as we move into the regular conference. So we hope that you'll stick around, and that this just the preludes to the regular conference have excited you and encouraged you and inspired you to come to the sessions next week. So Yolanda, Vernita, any last thoughts?
Well, I'm gonna let Yolanda go, and then I'm gonna go ahead and wrap out with our Q&A portion.
Perfect.
We'll just
Okay.
have so Yolanda, please.
Oh, I added my comments at the end. This is a journey, it's transformative, and we're all responsible. We have a last slide with references to some books and resources that we recommend. And we will be happy to send the slides if anybody would like to have them, or any questions. I don't know if people have questions or comments or lessons learned that they want to share.
So I'll just wrap up with my final thought for everyone about history and harm. And I know in the breakout I was in, we talked about that a lot, and that aligns with the caring and the whole person piece, and recognizing that no matter where we go on this planet, we're still humans, and that we all have a history, and we have a shared history, and we all have harm that has happened to us. So that if we can create more mindful spaces, we like that term, organizational communities. We use that a lot in OmniG. And so I would also invite you, we have two panels, right, Jerry, for next week. One is the early career panel that is an extension of this. So please check the program for that, for the additional panels on this particular topic where there could be more discussion. And then I guess we have a few minutes left here for any Q&A, if anyone has any questions they'd like to present to myself, Jerry, or Yolanda.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thank you. Yeah, thank you for mentioning the panels coming up. We're extending this conversation into two, I believe they're Wednesday, the 23rd and the 24th. The other thing that we have is a Google Doc that did get sent. I hope that I sent it out, but if not, I will again to both SCRA and CERA members, and so that everyone gets it with the other sessions that we're holding. I want to say it's the 23rd and the 24th, or they're both on the 23rd, right behind each other, but we'll get specifics on them.
Yes. So any questions from anyone, or for? Yes, Megan Greason.
It looks like Amber at the SCRA username might have been before me.
I can wait to until the end to say a few words, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure how well this aligns with the exact focus of the workshop, but I wondered if you have any recommendations for convincing institutions of the approach you discussed around bringing in an external DEI and justice expert as opposed to relying on internal institutional folks to do that work. Because I would like to convince some institutional leaders of that.
So I could for just a second, I'll speak briefly on the piece from a practice and corporate perspective. Part of what we've been sharing with organizations is that bringing someone from the outside, because sometimes it's a concern of their culture being exposed, of some of the things that the practices that they have being exposed. But what we've told them is by bringing someone from the outside, you're getting that additional perspective. And when that person is not tied to a paycheck, it's easier for them to have anonymity and to be able to really point out the things that they can see. So, and again, I can talk to you more about that, Megan, if you want to contact me after in more detail, but that's kind of the overarching comment that I have.
Thank you. That would be really helpful.
My comment about it, I agree, but I think it also depends. Often we need to look within inside to see what skills and knowledge and expertise can be optimized, and then identify what the needs are from the stakeholders. For instance, in our case, I am in the College of Applied Health Sciences at UIC. So we have quite a few faculty experts on these issues. But based on conversations with faculty and people, we identify one of the needs is someone from the outside who could give faculty feedback on how to integrate DEI in clinical cases. So often faculty would design a case. This is, and often without being intentional and being mindful about it, they perpetuate stereotypes. So the case is a Latino Mexican guy with who came in for this health issue. And we're having those conversations that often we as faculty don't know how to present cases in a way that do not perpetuate stereotypes. So I think it's easier when you bring somebody from outside, if you identify before you do that a specific need that your stakeholders have.
Yeah.
Because then you know what you're looking for, right?
Agreed, that's helpful. Yeah.
Looking into inside of how to optimize expertise. Because often the dilemma is that people have the myth that, oh, we bring from somebody from outside, give us feedback, give us a workshop, and they're gone. And then the effort just gradually fades out. So even if you bring from somebody from outside or create capacity within inside, there needs to be, like somebody said earlier, a check mark for accountability and an intentional effort to integrate it throughout.
It's a both and. Yeah, I agree with that. And we have internal folks working on it, but I also think that sometimes that external can come with more credibility too, and not like, oh, well, you're just biased or something. So not that they can't perceive that with an external person too, but still, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but so I do want to share too as well, is that I have to straddle the middle of the line there as well, because one of the things that I think happens or can happen when you totally look to external sources is that you disregard, or that others in the internal structure may feel left out when that is their areas of expertise. And so if there's a collective, and we always talk about collaboration, right? When there is a collaboration, then you get the buy-in from, I always think about buy-in as a former executive director. I'm always going to think about the investment. Is the staff or whoever it is going to invest in what we're doing? And that happens with collective thought process when you, and especially in this area, and when you're talking about this type of work, you do have people that are you know, rather than experts, let's just say they're versed or well versed in it, and this is their passion, et cetera, in their work. And so to that end, for campuses and universities as well as corporations, is why that they're turning to a Pacific. For example, Adler has a Pacific diversity and equity inclusion department. Where we have leaders in that space, and to apply for a faculty position, I think it's any position, you also have to be interviewed by that particular department, right? They have a core position in the interviewing space. And so to that end, that, you know, they're working, this synergy is there to do that. So, you know, bringing someone in and relying on others in, and you know, we do have to look too at helping bring forward internal staff and internal leadership, et cetera. We have to bring them forward if we think they're biased, right? Or if we can't leave them out of the equation because they may be. And so to that end, I think, yeah, this collective way of
and Jerry, I was going to add in there, as you were talking, I was thinking external people, internal people, and then having this ongoing sort of rotation of making sure that people stay, you know, focused on that whole person, staying knowledgeable, staying up to the trend, so that there might be a way to do external, internal, and an integrated group that keeps all that information fresh and makes sure that biases are not, you know, don't surface and things like that. So it is really an investment.
Yeah, you don't want resentment internally to set up because you've been overlooked.
Yeah, one of the bottom line issues, how do we create capacity within ourselves and the people we work with, faculty, students, to be able to address these issues? I want to respond to Oya's question. I want to give credit to the students. The students at UIC, through all the civic unrest that happened throughout the last few years, have been pushing us and challenging us to think and do differently. They've been asking, we want accountability, want UIC faculty to be, what are we doing? And they were asking and challenging us to think differently. So I am proud of our students because they challenged me, they challenged my colleagues to do differently, to think differently, and then asking concrete steps. What are we doing? What are you doing? So just to give you a couple of examples, we created at the college level an inclusive excellence committee with student representation on how to address racial justice, how to integrate DEI. UIC put together a committee with the student rep on revision of our policies for promotion and tenure, and they just passed 3 months ago, a new policy that promotion and tenure to CERA needs to have a statement about what your contributions have been to DEIRJ. So the students, I really give credit to the students who are pushing us to think and do differently with all the right, the challenges, and we need to respond to that challenge because they are our key consumers.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was going to say, to add to that, is that in statements of teaching philosophy, et cetera, when you're sitting on the committees, and this is academia and both practice as well, if you're sitting on the hiring committee, those philosophies now, those teaching statements should include your ideals or your work your action on DEIRJ work.
Mm.
They should, nobody should be getting hired to, and this is just, throwing this out here, in any space that doesn't have a paragraph or something about their own philosophies, right? About DEIRJ, et cetera. I mean, it's gotta be in there.
Yeah.
And so, we can suggest that when we're asked to sit on search committees and have an opportunity to interview. And if they don't have it in there, it's safe to ask, what do you feel about DEI?
Yeah.
And I have to add to that on those statements that because you can have teaching and personal statements that are sort of canned, right? And so you can go out and Google some sample and write it up, but that there are points in the statement that make it clear that the person is really engaged in doing the DEI work. So that we need to see some examples, the investment interest, and like have clear contributions to that. So I 100% agree, Jerry.
And when it's part of an institution or setting policies and practice, we tend to be intentional because there are consequences, right? Accountability.
And somewhere along the way, it's because we talked in our breakout about just actually really just caring enough to do this work and to be willing to create a world where we're all comfortable and we're all welcomed and we're all collaborating and contributing together. So at some point, going through the motions hopefully will become more organic and embodied.
Mm.
So if no one has any other questions, I know Amber, you wanted to share something, and so we have about like 6 minutes left. So Amber.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Just wanted to reiterate that we do have 2 BIPOC listening sessions this evening as a pre-conference workshop, as well as 1 more white allyship session, which is tomorrow. Thursday will conclude our pre-conference sessions. There's still time to register for the biennial, and I've placed the link into the chat, and I hope to see more of these conversations continue next week.
So again, thank you everyone for participating today. We really appreciate the enthusiasm and the breakouts and the excitement for this session. And we hope that from here you will develop some amazing using this tool and other resources that you have, and inform yourselves and get policy and practice going, and then also be those disruptors of the status quo that create new cultures of welcoming, inclusive diversity, and equitability.
Yes.
And thank you again so much.
Thank you.
So much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Next week for sure.
Have a
Yeah,
good
we've got,
afternoon.
don't forget, we got 2 panels extending this conversation coming up next week. Please look at your program, your programs, and we've got Christine Robinson on here. I know that she is coming up next week as well with a great session that has to do with mass incarceration. Dr. Vernita Perkins and other CERA members are coming up next week. Anne Marie, I can't forget you. There's Anne Marie doing a session on publish or perish. I know you'll want to make sure you join her there in that group as well. So we'll see
And I was going to say
there.
Cherie as well.
Yeah.
Cherie
Take
will be
care.
there too.
Yeah.
Bye everyone. Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye, thank you.